thank you for joining us all today on this fine Saturday afternoon. And we are, of course, joined by Victoria, the best-selling author of the Vicious trilogy, or soon-to-be trilogy, which we have just done our 10-year collector's anniversary edition for. It's just well, myself, I'm Jamie, I'm from LitPins&Co, and Meg here is our social media manager as well. And why don't you tell us a little bit about, I suppose, Vicious as a starting point. So obviously it was a book of your heart, the weird little book that you wanted to write. What is it that spoke to you about Vicious?
Well, I wrote Vicious, let's see. I was 25 and my publishing career was off to a very, very rocky start. And I was actually planning to quit. And Vicious was kind of my last hurrah. I had always wanted to write a super villain story. I really wanted to explore how arbitrary the definitions of hero and villain were, how it was simply like based on which side you fell. So I originally had this idea for kind of two teams, and the heroes and the villains. And the only reason that the villains were the villains was because they hated someone on the heroes team. And as I was trying to pick apart this idea, I was looking at the captains, so to speak, of my two teams, and they were Victor and Eli. And as I sat down to kind of brainstorm their backstory, what actually happened was I realized that it was their story entirely. I like to describe it as like Magneto and Professor X in a toxic bromance, like in a toxic college bromance. I really wanted to write fantasy. I really wanted to write a story about, it sounds like these are many disparate ingredients, but it's like how there are ingredients in a meal. I wanted to write a story about ambition and obsession. I wanted to write fantasy that felt extremely grounded in the medical sciences. And so I wanted to see if I could kind of make you believe. Could I write something realistic enough that it was conceivable that this process of gaining superpowers through near-death experiences could seem feasible?
Yeah.
How does it feel? Oh, sorry, Meg first.
No, I was just going to say, obviously it's been like a whole 10 years since it's come out. So how has the way people have latched onto the book, how's that been over the last 10 years? Was there anything that people have latched onto that you didn't expect? Characters, quotes? How have you found it all?
I mean, to be honest, nobody was ever going to read this book. That was the thing when I wrote it, which is that like it was unpublishable. It was at a time when, and kind of still is a time when I was told you can't write a comic book without pictures. You can't write, superheroes and supervillains in a non-DC or Marvel universe. Like everything about it was deeply unsellable. And because of that, I felt really liberated to just write what I wanted to write. I gave it to my agent, who was like, yeah, this is probably unsellable, but I'll try. And then Tor bought it in a surprise turn, but even they were like, no one's probably going to read this. It's not very sellable, but we're really interested in what you do next. So at every point, nobody thought Vicious was going to work, but I think what made it work is that it was weird in the exact ways that I'm weird, and it was extremely unapologetic about that. It wasn't trying to conform to a market. It was kind of deeply adversarial with the market, but it was also just something I had enjoyed writing so much that I think it came through in the story. So the first major surprise was simply that it sold. And the second major surprise was that people read it. But I want to be really, really clear. It's easy to retcon a career, and people will often look back at my earlier books now and be like, oh, then that was a bestseller and that was a bestseller. Vicious was never a bestseller, ever. It has gone on to sell hundreds of thousands of copies, but it has done it in this like extremely slow and regimented way of organic growth year over year, which is something I credit entirely to the readers. This is a book series whose success has been born of hand-to-hand like contact, hand selling. So yeah, the biggest surprise over the last decade is simply that like so many people have fallen in love with Victor and Eli and Sydney and Serena and Mitch and Dole. It's extremely validating. As I work on the third book, it's obviously extremely daunting as well because I wanted to write by them. And it was always supposed to be a trilogy. But I had been really burned by a YA series right before it, the kind of the one that made me want to leave publishing. And that was supposed to be a trilogy, and it got canceled 2 books in. And so I was so shy of having that happen to me again that I was like, even though I want this to be a trilogy, I'm going to write the first book so that it can stand alone, so that when it doesn't sell, I will be okay with that. So yeah, it's kind of been a book series full of surprises at every turn, simply because the expectations weren't there.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing seeing the way it's grown and taken on such a huge and vibrant life. It's honestly incredible.
It's fun. It's exciting. It's nice when readers find story organically like that. Like, I'm very lucky these days to have quite a publishing machine behind me helping, but there's just something extremely special about readers just discovering something that they love and then championing it.
Definitely.
What would you say is, well, something about this particular world or universe that you love in particular? Like, how would you compare it to your other ones? Like, do you associate with any of the other universes with these characters? Would there be crossovers?
No, this is not a Cosmere kind of situation here, right? This is not like, but I will say the thing that I love most about the characters is not just the moral ambiguity, because I'm obviously somebody who really loves writing antagonists. And one of the kind of the theories at the center of this series is that in the near-death experience, which results in powers, there's something lost as well, a bit of humanity, a bit of care. And so it's really fun to write characters who are able to kind of set down the moral trappings of conscience. And it's not to say that they're anarchic. Most of them are extremely driven by some force, but it's self-interest. And so in addition to writing extremely morally gray characters, I just really like writing the superpowers, because in the villain series, Vicious, Vengeful, and the upcoming Victorious, superpowers are a result of the near-death experience, but it's not arbitrary. It's a result of the context of the near-death experience and the final thoughts of the person going through it. And also, not everyone who has a near-death experience gets powers. It's like takes a specific kind of personality, a specific kind of context. And so kind of reverse engineering the powers that I want to play with in the series is one of my favorite things, because I'll be like, okay, I want a person that can change one element into another, right? Okay, well, what kind of situation could have led to them thinking something that could explain that power? And it also makes every power extremely personal and extremely unique. So even though Sydney and Serena both fall through a frozen lake, their final thoughts are very, very different and then shape their powers. And then I have this like a bonus round, which essentially is if an EO, that's what they're called, extraordinaries, if they're resurrected a second time by a force, they have a glitch. And essentially their powers don't work the way that they did before. So I then get to kind of follow that logic down the road and say, okay, well, Victor Vale has the ability to control pain thresholds, but what happens if he glitches? Like, what does it look like? And for him, what it looks like is that he starts to die all over again, the way that he died the first time. And it's an extraordinary painful. And then it ends with this like cataclysmic energy blast that levels everyone around him, and then he wakes up and they don't. So it's really fun to start exploring the aftermath. I'm really interested as a writer in cause and effect, and I get really annoyed as a reader when I feel like cause and effect tracked through a story. So I really like having the opportunity to kind of play things forward and game it out and say, what next, what next, what next?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, you mentioned the moral ambiguity and the moral grayness, which very much feels almost like your signature at this point, and I absolutely love it. I'm such a sucker for morally grey characters. So how did you find like writing those characters when you first invented them so long ago versus approaching them now? Has anything changed?
I mean, that's the tricky part, isn't it? I've changed. Like, Victor and Eli have always kind of been two facets of my own personality, to the point where they're named after me, and then my editor realized that too late in the editorial process to make me change it. So my name's Victoria Elizabeth. I am much more Victor than I am Eli, but they are two sides of the coin that is my identity. And so they've always been really, really personal to me. And then it's tricky though, because as a writer, one of the things that you want to have happen is growth, creative growth. And so that means writing a series over the course of a decade, which is what this is like a little bit of a psychological minefield, because I'm really aware of the ways in which I've grown and changed as an author. And I want to be able to have my writing in a series like this grow with me. But so I don't want it to feel like I'm like fanficking myself. I don't want it to feel like I'm trying to capture a voice I don't have anymore. So it becomes about like, how can the characters and the voice and the storytelling grow with me in a really organic way? Luckily, my readers are very trusting. They know that I'm going to give them the best story that I can.
Definitely.
Even if it hurts.
Touched on the power. It always hurts. We can't. We're level of expectation now. We know it's going to hurt, but we're going to enjoy it.
I know. Anyone who goes into these books thinking that characters aren't going to die has not been paying attention to the core principle of this series.
They're in for a wild ride.
Yeah.
But also, anyone who comes into the series and assumes that everyone is going to stay dead is also weirdly disconnected from the premise of the series.
Yeah.
As long as Sydney's about, you can't be sure.
Exactly.
So as you mentioned the powers before, so we've got a fun question. So if you were an EO, what sort of power do you think that you would have?
I know.
We kind of discussed this when we went through packing the special edition as well.
Yeah. Oh, I want to know both of yours then. I'll go first to give you a second. I know exactly what power I would have. I haven't figured out exactly what the circumstances of the near death would be to conjure the power, but I would want to have the ability to control time with a major caveat that I would only want to go forward or pause, because I think that going back is when you get into a huge amount of like trouble. But I really just want the ability to speed up, slow down, and hit pause. And the way that I can see it, that doesn't actually cause any timeline damage to like the greater space-time continuum, but it would allow me to say pause for a year and read a lot of books or write something or feel like I'm not running out of time continuously.
Yeah. Mine would sort of be a flip of yours almost. So like my root cause is that I'm going to be vulnerable now. I'm terrified of dying.
Sure.
So yeah, so I would sort of be the reverse, where very much like Galaxy Quest, where they have a 13-second time reversal. I would basically opt for that, but only enough time for me to correct, say, a single mistake to prevent the death or whatever happens or an accident.
Yeah, I like that. Of course, it presumes that you're not the one dying in that situation.
Yeah, presumably. Otherwise, I can't hit reset.
Exactly. What about you, Megan?
I feel like I'd love to have one like yours, Victoria, but I fear that in reality I'd panic in death and something would go horribly wrong and I'd end up with a power I wouldn't want. So when we came up with it, I think it would be something to do with being able to like see like people's ends or what's going to happen to them.
Oh, yeah.
Because I'm such like a bit of a control freak and I feel the need to know everything. So I feel like that combined with the panic.
Well, here's the thing. I'm going to tell you, I think it's a bad power. And I can say that because I gave it to a character. I have a comic called Extraordinary. And the character in that comic can see other people's deaths in reflective surfaces around them. And like the question becomes like, can you change it? And is there any good in knowing what those deaths are if you can't?
Exactly. I think it would be an awful power to have. And
terrible.
I do not want it, like, at all. But I fear that would be the sort of thing I'd end up with.
The problem with this series is, as its writer, I spend a great deal of time logicking out powers and what they mean for the people that have them. So I play with a lot of different scenarios of like what kind of powers I can give people and then how does it ruin their lives.
Yeah, exactly.
I think we did sort of notice how like people's powers do seem like inherently tied to their personality as well.
Yeah. I mean, you can take it a step further, which is that like, and this is the thing I was exploring in a scene I was working on today, which is that if you look at Victor and Eli, their powers are in direct conversation with each other. It's vulnerability and invulnerability. Like they are kind of each other's blind spot a little bit. And that was designed entirely intentionally.
So thinking of the two characters, it feels very harsh asking if you have a favorite character. I know that's like a no-go question because how are you meant to choose? But was there one whose like point of view you preferred writing from, or maybe one who was harder to write than the other?
Ooh, I mean, I am very Victor. Like, this is the thing. Victor is my favorite character because he's me. That sounds weird. Victor is my favorite character to write because he's like me, I understand how to write him. Eli was more fun to write because he's a bit wild. I mean, like, it's like they kind of exist. It depends on whether you subscribe to the psychological theory that psychopathy and sociopathy are different poles on the same spectrum. I really disagree with the concept that psychopathy and sociopathy are synonymous. They're really different. And I would put Eli at the psychopathic end and Victor at the sociopathic end. And I think psychopaths are more fun to write. I also think that the thing that's so important is, like, I kind of hinted at this earlier, there's no apathy in this series. Like, apathy and anarchy, they're not really present in this. Everyone cares really deeply about something. And I think as long as your characters care, regardless of what it is they care about, they're fun to write. I have really no interest in writing characters who are just like along for the ride, who are just kind of wilding out. Everyone needs to have a reason, because otherwise I don't think they would be the kind of person who came back in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. There's that level of like desperate desire, which means you're going to become an EO, so you can't just not care. Yeah.
Obviously, though, my favorite character is the dog. Mostly because I have this thing with reading where if there's an animal in the book, I will immediately go online to make sure that animal doesn't die, because I'm not interested in it. And so it was a tricky moment. So for anyone who's watching or listening who hasn't read the book, there is a dog named Dole. He is a Great Dane, and he does die for approximately 2 minutes. And then he is promptly resurrected by Sydney. Every time that dog dies in the course of the series, he will be resurrected. And there will never be a day where that dog will in the future die of old age on a farm, but it is not going to happen in this book. My pets in my books, the rare times that I put them in there, will live to the end of the world. The humans will never, but the animals are safe.
And that's the important thing.
That's the important thing. That's the important thing. Also, it's a delight to write because I love animals. I have 3 of them in the room with me right now, and I never put them in books because of that, because I just am like, oh, it's just gonna, I don't want to write them into the book if I can't use them in a dramatic way, and I don't want to use them in a dramatic way because I like them more than people. So Dole was a little bit my exception to get to write him into a book and have all of his mannerisms and know that he was safe.
Yeah, it did scare me when I was reading Fishes for the first time, though. I was like, oh my goodness.
It should. And it should still freak you out a little bit every time he does die, because, like, you know, there might be a time when he can't be resurrected anymore. It gets a little harder for Sydney every time. It's like scar tissue. But yeah, Dole's in it for the long haul.
Good.
So going back to those sort of scenes, are there any particular scenes in Vicious that you prefer writing? So obviously the book is obviously a blend of fight scenes and more introspective character studies as well.
Oh, fight scenes.
Your preference?
Fight scenes. I mean, specifically death scenes, like death scenes being like the origin story transition scenes wherein a character gains their powers. Like Victor and Eli on the ice bath is my favorite scene in Vicious. It was my favorite one to write. I had like a medic on speed dial, like that was like texting. I was like, can I do this? But it really helps to have like a doctor at some point as an author, as an associate, so that you can ask questions. But yeah, I think anytime there's like a threshold that being crossed in a scene, fight scenes are really fun, but they're also really hard for me because I have the opposite of a non-visual memory. I see everything like a movie in my head, and then I have like a camera in my hand moving through it. And there's a lot of sharp cutaways in the series because I want it to feel like a comic book without pictures. And so it's great when it's done, but it's like a puzzle as I'm writing it. And it can be quite tricky to figure out how to like make it feel like it's all happening simultaneously. But because you're reading words instead of seeing pictures on a screen, it can't happen simultaneously. So I have to figure out ways to trick the reader's brain into processing multiple storylines as happening simultaneously.
Yeah. And I mean, speaking of that, like picturing it as a screen versus book, have you ever like imagined what an adaptation of Vicious could look like? Be that film, TV?
Oh yeah. I mean, I've seen it, like I've seen vision boards for it both ways. Like we have not successfully brought it about yet, but like I planned for like 8 months. I worked on a TV pitch for it that was I loved it, and it just wasn't meant to be. And maybe one day as a feature. But I think the thing that I like about the villains world is that the powers on the whole are pretty grounded. Like it's not really bombastic. A lot of the powers are not super like hyper CGI or visual.
No one's like flying around and projectiles from their hands.
I've never written a flying EO just because I don't know. It's like that, and capes feel a little dumb to me. And so no EOs have ever actually flown in my world. But yeah, I mean, I would love nothing more than to see it one day. I would love it as an anime. It'll never happen, but I think it would make a really cool anime.
That would be so cool.
I can imagine it very much in like the arcane art style. That would be phenomenal. Yeah.
Yeah, it's tricky. There's like 3 companies in LA that do animation. And so it's really, really tricky to get anything made. It's just tricky to get anything made anywhere under anything, but a little bit of like behind the curtain business is just that like animation is truly one of the hardest mediums to get to sell anything into because it's a really small industry.
Yeah, I can imagine.
So with Victor and Eli, obviously you mentioned that they bounce off of each other.
Yeah.
So they are obsessed with each other.
Yes.
So the intensity of their feelings is rarely matched, especially in non-romantic relationships.
Yeah.
Would you think, because me and Meg were discussing this earlier, would you have thought that they would go as far as they did without the other?
No.
They are each other's catalyst.
I mean, not to like, I'm trying very hard to avoid spoilers, but like it gets very hard for either one of them when the other is not part of the narrative, because so much of what they're doing is pushing against each other, that like they both struggle with like the aftermath of things. Like they struggle when each one thinks they have lost the other in some way, simply because like they are self-defined by each other, like so much of their identity. And it was really important. I know a lot of people are always like, now kiss, and that's fine, but like this is a relationship about obsession, which is a different thing. And I think sometimes we conflate obsession and romance. And it's not that they can't coexist. In fact, many romances are obsessive, but also obsession can exist without romance. And there is a complexity to Victor and Eli's relationship that I totally understand why people are always like, now kiss. But at the same time, like it is a little reductive to what they feel towards each other, which is almost like a soulmate. They are like polarized to each other. And I think that it's hard for there to be a world wherein they don't exist together, because they really, like, as much as they hate each other and are constantly trying to kill each other, the fact is like trying to kill each other is a lot more fun than succeeding.
Definitely. I just want to add, that was a question from Kiara over on our Discord, so thank you to them for that question. Jamie and I saw it and we were like, oh, we want to know that. Yeah. So you mentioned, obviously, no spoilers, which like obviously completely get it. But is there anything you can share about Victorious, or is it just too early days, absolutely nothing, you want to keep completely silent, which is fine?
I don't want to share anything about it yet. I'm like, I basically hit the halfway point today. So like it's really trucking. I don't trust myself because I have like no filter, and I feel like I can feel my like publicist staring at me through the screen, being like, don't do it. What can I say is no, I can't say. Oh wait, I can say.
Are we feeling positive about it?
Oh yeah, I mean, I felt really negative for a little while because something happened wherein this happens to me sometimes. This happened with The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue too. If I wait too long to write a book, it gets stuck like in my head, and then it's like an extraction process instead of a creative process. So there's a little bit of white knuckling happening, trying to get it from the unsafe space of my brain onto the safe space of the page. I will say I have a new villain. Because there's always a new villain. There's always like a cat, like it was Marcella in Vengeful. I have a new one, and I'm very excited. I will say this is the most neurotic book that I have ever written, in the true sense that it is about like the power of the mind. And there is a component that is inspired by WandaVision.
Ooh, that's
perceptual realities.
Ooh, thank you. That was
now. How can I pull off a visual mind game in a written medium? I'm not sure. I haven't gotten to that part of the book yet. We're fine.
Well, I'm excited to find out, and thank you for sharing anything. So that was wishful thinking on my behalf. So. Yeah,
you shot your shot.
Well, we've got a few audience questions that were submitted via our Discord. So Eden would like to ask, so what was the inspiration behind the method of getting the EO powers? And linking to that, did you ever imagine the characters having a different ability than the one that they ended up with?
No, I'll go backwards. The characters always have the ability that they have because the ability is so intrinsic to their person, to their psychological profile as I design them. I also am the kind of writer that plays God. I know everything about everything. I'm not a discovery as I go writer. But I really, really wanted to do the powers this way because I felt like powers in comic books were always arbitrary. Like somebody falls in a vat of acid, but then whatever power they come out with is just like doesn't seem related to the acid. And I just felt like it was a missed opportunity creatively to like show the steps, to breadcrumb like the reasoning. Plus, I just really like anything which creates a psychological bent. And then when you give meaning to the power, you have to ask, okay, but then what was it that defined it? Was it the person's natural? Is it nature or nurture? Is it circumstance? Is it psychology? And I just think it was a really fertile direction. So I knew I wanted to write superpowers, and I knew I wanted them to be complicated. And I felt like giving them a tether in terms of context was a way to make them really interesting and not arbitrary.
So I guess very linked to that, someone on our Discord, whose name is Eli's number one attorney in our Discord.
We had to include.
I love it. Love it. I love Eli. Eli never gets enough love.
I agree. Eli's great. So they ask, is it possible for people's powers to combine or amplify one another's? Or would that be something that you think could be possible?
It could definitely be possible. I mean, it depends on the nature of the power. I usually don't put like, electricity and water in the same room, but hypothetically, you could. Yeah, I mean, I don't think they would amplify in the simple way of like, oh, you put these two people together and they just inherently get stronger. But I do think there's ways for powers to play with each other. I think there's ways for, just the same way there's ways for people to team up. I think there's ways for them to use their power synchronistically. I haven't really played with it yet, mostly just because they tend to be so self-interested. But I think it's more likely that people put each other's powers to use than it is that their powers actually augment. It would have to be very, very specifically geared towards each other. But hypothetically, yeah, it would. I mean, that's a great fanfic territory.
Definitely.
But another one from Eli's number one attorney. Obviously, you mentioned that you know your characters. You plan everything within an inch of its life. So, what EO abilities would your other characters from other series have, like Kel, Lila, Addie, Henry, Luke?
I mean, Addie has a power. It's just not a good one, is it? I think Henry's ability would be to know other people's stories. Like, I think he would be a really great transcriptionist in that way. Like, Henry doesn't really want to tell his own story, but he really wants to like know other people's stories. I think he'd be a really great librarian in that sense, but like for lives. As for like Shades of Magic, it's almost hard for me to fathom just because I write like those fantastical systems are so wildly different that it would have to are we talking about, do we take Kel's powers away to give him something else? So because those powers are like, here's the thing, even though one is called magic and one is called like superpowers, it's the same thing. It's the same system. They're both born out of hyper organic, naturalistic processes. I build all of my magical systems as if they're physics, as if it's nature, to try and make sure that it feels as grounded as possible. So yeah, there's like a branch that happens there. All of my characters are just branching in different magical systems. And one of the best examples I can give for that is Sydney Clark in Vicious and Cassidy Blake in City of Ghosts. These are like two 11-year-old girls, 12-year-old girls, who both nearly die in the exact same way. But because I've built different magical systems around them, Sydney Clark comes back with superpowers, as we call it, and Cassidy Blake comes back with the ability to cross into the land of the dead. But they're like, it's just painted. The room is painted differently, but it's the same room underneath.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So another one from Kiara over on Discord. They ask that, well, they talk a bit about the fact that Victor is such like a double-sided person in a way. Like he will torture others without batting an eyelid almost, but he also like takes in Sydney and clearly seems to truly care for her. So they were wondering, do you think Victor ever could have become a true hero, or do you think he was always destined to have that little bit of a dark side?
Yeah, Victor's not a hero because he's too self-aware, and I think heroes are kind of naive in that, like, I actually don't think most quote unquote heroes are like either realistic or good people, meaning they can be realistic, but they're not good people, or there can be good people, but they're not realistic. They're very, not vanilla, but like they just tend to be like the simplest version of the story. Yeah. So I think that's why I find heroes to be less, hero with a capital H, right? To be less interesting. So Victor was always going to be self-interested. What I don't think is that Victor is a pure sociopath. I think Victor wishes he was a pure sociopath because he would like to care even less than he does. I think Victor is somebody who is extraordinarily good at compartmentalization and always has been. And I think for Victor, actions speak a lot louder than words. And so like he does care about Sydney and Mitch, and it bothers him just the same way that he cares about Eli. And it bothers him. But it runs through Victor's own personal machinery, right? It runs through like how he sees the world. And so, you know, maybe he won't use the same terminology, like he wouldn't use love and family and stuff like that. But at the same time, he's not going to let anybody hurt the people that he cares about. And that, if that's not loyalty, what is?
Exactly. He's so fiercely protective, and that almost in a way prevents him from ever being a true hero with a capital A.
And he lies to himself, right? He calls it like possessiveness, like, oh, they're mine. I laid claim to them. She's my EO. I need her powers. But at the same time, like he's still protecting.
Yeah, definitely.
He's afraid to show that vulnerability.
Yeah. So he recontextualizes it through strength.
So going on Victor's powers, so if he had died during his first EO attempt, what powers do you think he would have got that way, or would they have?
The overdose.
Yeah,
I mean, probably the ability to like put people to sleep, like some kind of like, you know, a dreamer, if you would. I mean, the thing is, he learns really quickly that like peacefulness is really antithetical to like the EO making process, because you have to have fear, you have to have pain, you have to have panic, because that's what triggers the stress, like the adrenocortisol stress levels that bring you to back from the edge. So, I mean, it didn't work, but I think he would have been somebody who could almost like, he could be a somnambulist, right? He could be somebody who like makes people fall asleep. But it would be too chill for him.
It would be such an interesting take on his character, though. Imagine him throughout the series, rather than like putting up the pain down, he's just like, nope, bedtime. Go
away. He basically, you know, and we sometimes see him do it throughout the series when he just essentially overloads people's nerves and he just cuts the power to them when he doesn't have time. He can drop a room. So weirdly, same thing, right? He just it's the less gentle version of it.
Yeah, definitely.
But then he wouldn't be able to finger gun people.
I love that bit with that a little mention of him taking down someone across the room with a finger gun. That made me giggle. I enjoyed that.
It's my little in many ways this series is a love letter to Cowboy Bebop, and it's something that happens in Cowboy Bebop. I would say that the later half of the series is a love letter to the TV show Hannibal. So those two forces join to make the villains.
Incredible. So a quick break from the Discord questions. On our Instagram Live, someone called Cozy Book Club, I hope I've got that username right, has asked whether you think animals could ever be EOs in the villains universe.
Ooh. You know, that's really, I mean, I would like that. I've never thought about that, because mostly I think so much about the psychological process, and there's so much question about like, obviously animals are intelligent, but do they process things the same way that we do? And like how much thinking is required, like how much intentionality is required. So for that reason, I'm going to say no, only because I don't think that they would have the same thought pattern. They would have the stress level, but honestly, I think a lot of wild animals anyway operate at such a high stress pattern anyway that it wouldn't really trigger. Trying to logic it out. I'm going to say no, which is probably for the best, because I do not want either of my cats to have powers. They're already like the demons that live in my house. So I'm going to say, we're going to keep it to people.
If my cat could be an EO, we would never hear the end of it. She would completely take charge. We'd never have free will again.
I worry about what would happen like if my dog could talk. And then that's also, what do you get? Like, what is a power for an animal versus a person? Because is a power the ability to like speak person? But like, I don't know. I just as you can probably tell from my answer, like as a creator, I really have to be able to understand the logic for something. I'm somebody who could never just like if I wanted to write dragons into a book, which I don't, it's one of the few things that don't interest me. But if I did, I would like really need to understand why there were dragons. Like,
Oh,
it can't be
definitely.
like because magic. Like, I want there to be part of like what I love as a writer is convincing you that magic is real. And the way that I convince you that magic is real is just by creating a little fracture of doubt in your reality. And in order to create a fracture of doubt in reality, it has to be believable on some level. So I want to hew as close to reality as possible. So because of that, I really want things to like logic.
And I think that's part of what's so amazing about the way you build fantasy. Like, I've had people in my life who are like, I'm not sure if I'm a huge fantasy reader. I'm like, try V12s, but they feel so grounded. They're like this incredible like blend of fantasy and magical realism, and I just love it.
Oh, thank you.
Another fun question from Kiara over on our Discord. So Victor and Eli are teaming up like they were intended to in the beginning to take over the world. To stop them, you get to put together an elite team of 3 characters from your other books.
Oh my god!
Who would win?
Probably Luke from The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, Lila Bard from the Shades of Magic series. Oh my god, I'm picking people that really would not get along well together either. And I'm going to say Sabine. Sabine is actually for my upcoming novel, Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, so it doesn't really work for anyone but me. But she is probably the scariest villain I feel I've ever written. Ooh. So I feel that she would be able to hold her own.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just imagining.
For me as well.
Yeah. I'm just imagining
20% in.
Oh god.
I'm like.
I'm imagining Luke and Lila interacting, and I'm not sure.
I'm
not sure how that would go down.
Probably badly, but Lila doesn't get along with anyone, so it's okay.
No. Exactly.
She'd probably try to rob the devil, and then we would have a very different story on her.
Oh yeah.
But she would be successful, and she would have fun doing it.
Yeah, exactly.
So maybe it's worth it in the end.
Yeah.
Jamie, do you think it's time for your quickfire questions, or do you reckon we have time for one more audience question?
You can do one more audience question.
One more audience question, right? What shall I pick? Okay, so someone else on Discord, I have lost their username, apologies. No, it was Sunshine23. They said that obviously the characters are semi-biographical, as you've mentioned. But how did they and the others like almost appear in your mind? Was it a slow amalgamation, or was it like a just snap, here they are, bam, fully formed?
I don't ever have a snap. Like, I think it's great that authors have that, where they just like, they have a dream and they wake up and they have a whole novel in their head. Bully for them. I'm a very slow aggregator, but like I say, it started with that concept of like the 2 teams. It actually started with a completely different character with a completely different ability, and Victor and Eli were just minor pieces of it. So they really kind of just started as ideas, and I just knew that they were on opposite sides, and I knew they were on opposite sides because of something that had gone down between them. They'd had a falling out. That was all I had to start. Was like, I wanted it to feel like a comic book. I wanted to focus on these 2 groups of people. Obviously, Sydney and Serena were split on those teams as well. And I just wanted to figure out why they had a falling out. And I knew that like Sydney and Serena were sisters. So I'm like, okay, but how do 2 sisters end up on opposite sides of this fight? And so a lot of my work is just about asking those questions. So I'll have an idea, and then it just becomes like, okay, but why? Or but how? Or but what if? Why, how, and what if are kind of the firmament of all of the writing that I do. So I'll have an idea, and then I'll probably spend the next year just poking it to make sure that it can work. With Vicious, I remember of the 3 years that it took to write Vicious, one of those years entirely was spent on the structure because it's a braided narrative. And it was the first time I had ever done that in a novel. I have since done it many different ways and I try to make a structural challenge for myself for some reason every single novel, and it has to be the different structural challenge every single novel. So hate that for me, but it's like I have to amuse my brain, that corner of my brain in some way. But yeah, I know it started with just that question of like, who hurt you and why? Because I also was the concept that like I wanted to be relatable to them, and most of us can't relate to the urge for world domination, but we've all been hurt by somebody that we loved. And I think I was like, okay, we can relate to like the falling out. So what is the falling out?
Yeah, and I mean, I think how that plays out between for like Sydney as well, I think that's particularly interesting. I think the bond between the sisters is something I find so interesting in the book, and I really I find it really fascinating. I really enjoy reading it.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I've got some quick fire questions for you. It's
All
only
right.
3. But if you had to choose between Victor's power or Eli's, which one would you pick?
Eli's.
Ooh,
Because he can
interesting.
heal from anything.
Yeah,
He's
I guess.
he's immortal. He's unkillable. He's he can heal from anything.
I'm terrified of the concept of immortality, so for me, I'm like,
see,
oh no.
I would sell my soul in a heartbeat. That's how Addie LaRue got written. But yeah. Next.
My first instinct to that was, but is he immune to emotional damage?
No, not at all. Not at all. None of us are.
If you had Sydney's power, who would you resurrect, like a person from history?
Ooh, Oscar Wilde.
Ooh, that would be fun.
That's quirky.
I think he'd like to see the way things have gone now. I think that would be nice.
Yeah, exactly.
And then the last one is describe victorious in 3 words.
I've already said too much. Okay.
If you can't do victorious, then do vicious.
No, I'll do victorious. Yeah. It's finally the end.
Finally.
Incredible. It's 3 words.
Finally the end.
It works.
For better or for worse.
We've made it.
The end. Yeah. Full stop.
Amazing.
But yeah, so thank you for joining us today,
You're
Victoria.
so welcome.
One thing that we will leave the chat with is we do have a raffle to raise money for the California fires, where you can win a Vicious Collector's Box, so be sure to check that out. If you haven't already got a copy of Vicious yourself, if you do go to our link in our Instagram bio, we do have a special discount with Victoria's local bookshop, Portobello Bookshop, to give you a discount on Vicious in particular. And if you have already read Vicious and you're looking for something else to get into today, Addie LaRue is actually 99p on Kindle today as well.
Wow, I didn't know that. Nobody tells me anything.
But yeah, it's absolutely fabulous speaking to you this afternoon. And
of course, thank you for doing such a gorgeous edition.
Thank you. It's Vicious is very much the book of my heart. So Addie LaRue Addie LaRue got close, but she didn't.
It's fine. I'll just continue to chip away. It's like in Robin Hood Men in Tights where they're trying to do the bullseye competition with the arrows. I'm just gonna get you just have to splice through an arrow with another arrow.
Love it.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.